The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. The politics of geography, where Trump lost voters and why. How Nebraska became a Republican stronghold, plus Bill Press with former Democratic National Committee Chairman Tom Perez. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. In his newest book, author Ross Benesch explores Nebraska's political shift to the right. He says that if Democrats want to turn that around, they need to better understand the legitimate pain being felt in rural America today. And we say hello to Ross Benesch, journalist, research analyst, and author of Rural Rebellion: How Nebraska Became a Republican Stronghold. Ross Benesch, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on the podcast, Jim.
Well, it's nice to talk with you. You know, many of us think of Nebraska as a red state, but as you describe in your book, that has not always been the case. What was the Nebraska you grew up in?
Yeah, the Nebraska I grew up in was still conservative. No one's going to mistake it for like Massachusetts, but it was much more moderate than what we have today. The political leaders we elected back then weren't so extreme and they weren't so far to the right. And we regularly elected Democrats. I mean, back in 1990, for instance, that's when I was, 1 year old. We had a Democratic governor, 2 U.S. senators, 1 House rep, an attorney general. And now we have none of that. It's all Republicans, and it's far right Republicans at that.
And the story of your book is how politics in Nebraska changed. When did you start to see that shift to the right?
I didn't notice it as much when I was there. Part of that is because I was living in it. And part of it was because I was a young child who, just wanted to watch the Huskers whip ass on the football field. But when I did the research on it, what really stuck out was 1994, during the Republican Revolution, led by Newt Gingrich. They lost some Democratic seats in the area, in the Great Plains, including in Nebraska. And it just kept going that way. So 94 is like the first big inflection point. And then 2000 stands out again because that was when our last Democratic governor left. And it was the same year we adopted term limits in the legislature, which really gave the Republican Party more control over the state legislature. And the complete shift, I feel like, was finalized in 2012 when Ben Nelson was our last Democratic U.S. senator, and he left, and they nominated Bob Kerrey, who had been in New York for a long time, to try to replace him. And even though Kerrey had been really popular in Nebraska, he just got whipped, and everyone since him has gotten whipped since then. So 94 is like, I noticed the shift. 2000, some big developments happen. And by 2012, it's like, where are the Democrats? They have like no chance anymore. How did that happen in just, 15 years?
Right. And as you recently wrote for 538, this shift to the right, in part, has to do with the nationalization of American politics. What does that mean, and what has been the impact on Nebraska?
I'll give you a few examples to try to explain what I mean by that. So nationalization, what I'm referring to is when people pay more attention to the national party you're on than to the local issues you're pressing about. And this is really driven by the party leaders themselves, by activists, and by the very partisan press outlets that exist today. Now, 2 examples of that. One would be the last Omaha mayor's race. It started out being about potholes. Heath Mello was the Democratic candidate. These trying to win in an area that, Republicans have done very well in. And one point, his record on abortion rights in the legislature becomes super controversial because Washington activists pointed it out, and it just snowballed into this terrible press cycle. And Tom Perez denounced Heath Mello, and that certainly didn't help Heath Mello any. And Democrats, threw their own under the bus over an issue that really doesn't affect the mayor of Omaha at all. They were appeasing Washington activists. So it's hard to make your own platform when you have that happening, and social media really exacerbates it. The Democrats we used to have who won were like Bob Kerrey and Ben Nelson, Jim Exon. They deviated from their party in selective ways so that they could win conservative voters because they had to win in Nebraska. Very tough to do that now because the DNC chair may come and come after your head if you go against the national party's platform. And the nationalization is kind of tragic then, because once the Republicans are elected, for whatever reason, Nebraskans identify with Republicans more than they do with the National Democratic Party. So they've gone in this rightward direction. Well, you have our Republican governor now who implements a terrible policy where he says illegal immigrants aren't going to be eligible for COVID-19 vaccines. And to distract people from how bad that is as a public health rule, he gets to the podium and starts talking about something AOC said. What does a New York congresswoman have to do with policies in Nebraska? So the nationalization has been used to sink Democratic candidates, and it has been used by Republicans in power to distract people from things they're doing that, hurt Nebraskans locally.
Well, and in fact, you wrote about immigration as an example of this shift. How has the Republican position on immigration in Nebraska changed, and why?
Yeah, the Republican position has gone pretty far to the right. So when I was a kid in Nebraska, the Republicans I grew up with were people like Chuck Hagel, the former defense secretary and U.S. senator. And he actually helped co-sponsored legislation to provide a pathway to citizenship for the Dreamers. He was very much about immigration reform. Mike Johans, our Republican governor, would oppose raids. And now we have a governor and a state attorney general who have sued the federal government to end DACA. I mean, that's a very far right shift within that same party. And it mimics the national trend. Nationally, Republicans, if you just look at presidential elections, their share of Latino voters peaked in 2004 under George Bush, been downhill basically ever since, for the most part, with few exceptions. Nebraska politicians have mimicked that. And what's happened is that, in these rural areas, you have small towns that are dying. Their schools are closing, their main streets are boarded up. And at the same time, throughout, a handful of towns scattered throughout the area, you have expansion of meat packing. And, it's led them to hire many migrant laborers because they've made the benefits of those jobs so terrible when they slashed the unions that people who are actually born in the U.S. don't really want to work there. And Republicans have been able to redirect that anger that the people there have towards the immigrants. It's pretty tragic because certainly the immigrants who have come into that area didn't cause those towns to shutter, didn't cause those schools to close, didn't cause the benefits to go away from those jobs that they used to enjoy. But Republicans have done a masterful job of convincing people that they're partially to blame and directing that animosity toward them. And I think that's why you've seen the shift far right within that party, nationally and as well within my state.
We're speaking with Ross Benish, journalist, research analyst, and author of Rural Rebellion, How Nebraska Became a Republican Stronghold. And Ross, this is also a book about the rural-urban divide. And in Nebraska, that divide appears to be getting wider. What drives it?
It's definitely getting wider. Pete Ricketts, our governor, Deb Fischer, our Republican U.S. senator, they lost Omaha and Lincoln pretty big margins too. And they still were easily elected statewide by double digits because they win like 80 to 30 or 70. They win like 80 to 20 or 70 to 30 in these rural areas, these areas that are, more likely to be white, more likely to be conservative, more likely to have old people in there. They really drive up the margin in those areas, and it powers them to statewide victories. Now, as far as what drives that, there's a few things. One of them is I do believe that living in a small town, having lived in a town like Brainerd, which is 300 people, I lived there for almost 20 years. The way you perceive the government there is much different than when you live in a city. And Omaha is a pretty decent sized city. So when you're in Brainerd, you're doing business with people you know and trust. And even though the government actually spends more money per capita in small towns due to economies of scale, it doesn't feel that way to people. They just think the government's like another arbitrary enforcer to come in. So if someone says we need to have regulation around pollution, they'll say, why do we need that? Look at my, fields, look at my yard. Everything's great. It's in the cities where the problem is. So anytime the government tries to enforce a rule, whether it's like gun rights or pollution, even healthcare exchanges, it gets perceived in this big government way. It gets perceived in this big government light in a bad way. And I think that's just because the government's hand, the benefits of the government aren't as clear in a small town. Whereas in cities, self-government's like impossible because you have, tens of thousands of people who you don't know, who you have to come in contact with, and you need rules and agencies to guide that behavior. As if you don't, you'll have chaos. So there is just a natural sentiment in a rural area to not view the government as favorably. So you have that, and then right-wing media just pounces on that. And, those thoughts get recycled at the church pew and in the parking lot at the football game. And it becomes this self-perpetuating cycle where people really hate the government and they blame it all on Democrats. And, rural areas, they've also seen their prosperity shrink while cities have become more prosperous. And Nebraska, every time we do the census, Omaha and Lincoln grow. They become more prosperous. And like 85 other counties shrink. And because Democrats are the party of those in the cities, it becomes easy to blame them for the problems of why rural areas are doing so bad in comparison to cities. They don't blame the free market as much. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you just put a bag on your head and you believe whatever you want. I mean, even though the information is right there out in front of you, right?
Yeah, to a degree. And, you got to also think about the community you're living in when you're in a town like that. I could sit here and make a rational argument for why everything I just said is not actually factually true. But when you feel that, and the people who you spend all your time with feel that and express that, you don't really realize how radical the environment you are actually is. Like a lot of these politically divisive issues that are affecting our country now took hold in rural America during the 1990s culture war battles. But when I was a kid sitting in the church pew, like I didn't realize it was so atypical and so extreme. I mean, you have to get out to see the differences. And a lot of people don't get out. Nebraska has a huge brain drain problem. They have people who lean left who leave, and those who don't stay, and they stay there for a long time, and they don't go out and experience other things in the rest of the world where people view things differently.
Well, and you've written that the correlation between where you live and what party you vote for has only grown stronger, and it's hurting our country. What are the political consequences of anchoring politics in geography?
Yeah, well, the political consequences is you become much more likely to judge people in municipalities that are unlike your own. Sometimes I worry that I'm feeding into that just by describing this problem, by trying to bring attention to it. I've lived in New York City and I've lived in Brainerd, Nebraska. They're kind of the extreme opposites, but the views that they hold of each other are becoming more inaccurate, actually, as this divide happens. And education doesn't even fix it. There's been multiple studies showing that when you ask people who are Democrats with advanced degrees, what do Republicans believe about X, Y, and Z? Their likelihood of being correct of what those Republicans actually believe becomes more inaccurate with each degree they earn. So that's the problem that you face when it becomes reinforced by geography, because we all get in our little bubbles and we don't really realize how bad those bubbles are. We're
not in Brainerd.
No, we're not.
and therefore we don't think like folks that are in Brainerd. I mean, that makes sense. If we view Nebraska as a microcosm of our nation, What can Democrats learn from its shift to the right?
Well, one of the things I would say is that you just can't lose rural areas by 70 percentage points and expect to have a viable party in many states. That may work in states where you have major metropolises, but if you are in a state with very low population density, and Nebraska ranks 42nd in population density, it's a little bit of a losing proposition. And that makes it tough for Democrats to consistently control the Senate, because Republicans don't have to win most voters. They just have to win most voters in low population states, really. And the other thing I'd say that we can learn is that just laughing at these people or telling them that they're voting against their own interest and mocking them doesn't really help. We need to sympathize with the decay that has happened in these towns, the consolidation that's happening within their schools. The reasons behind that, I don't believe are what rural conservative Nebraskans believe they are, but there is legitimate pain there. And the more we mock them and denigrate them and view them as other, the less chance we have to earning their votes and understanding them.
There is a larger message in your book that's not just about Democrats, and that's about how all of us as Americans know each other. In this deeply polarized moment, what could help us do that?
Well, I think getting off social media would be the first.
Amen.
And I'm guilty of it too. I'm promoting this book right now, so I'm on Twitter way too damn much, and it's rotting my mind. But getting off there, I mean, gosh, the Facebook posts I see from my friends in Nebraska, they would think we're all, Antifa vandalists. The social media just drives inaccurate perceptions. And the other thing I would suggest, it's a little harder to do right now because we're all quarantined and there's this god-awful pandemic rippling through our country. But just spend some time in areas that are much more unlike your own and see if you notice some of the similarities in what people value there. People in small town Nebraskas value their local public schools, just like those in Brooklyn, New York do. There's things like that we could build upon. But instead, everything gets put through the lens of like the most divisive issues possible.
Absolutely. The author of Rural Rebellion, How Nebraska Became a Republican Stronghold. He's Ross Benish, journalist, research analyst, joining us today on the America's Democrats broadcast. Ross, we appreciate your time with us. Would love to have you back and talk more about it soon.
Oh, that would be awesome. Thanks for having me on, Jim.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, what Trump failed to understand about suburban voters. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The Democratic Party establishment has a message for us progressives. Go away. That club of don't rock the corporate boat congressional leaders and their hired political operatives keep trying to purge progressive activists and policies from the party. Even when the candidates of these old-line forces win, as Joe Biden did, they can't seem to stop assailing grassroots progressives who supply the new ideas, energy, organizing, and votes that are the party's future. They're furious that we upstarts are making gains and pushing Democrats to be, well, Democrats. Just hours after polls closed on November 3rd, a group of timorous congressional Democrats joined in a game of pin the tail on progressives. They wailed that our demands for such egalitarian policies as Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, and criminal justice reform, quote, scares voters and caused 8 centrist Democrats in swing districts to lose their House seats. One of the leading complainers, Representative Jim Clyburn, even insisted that those pushing a People's Democratic agenda would be the death of the Democratic Party. If, quote, we are going to run on Medicare for all, socialized medicine, we're not going to win, he proclaimed. Never mind that we taxpayers already provide socialized medicine for him and his colleagues. And never mind that he happens to be a top recipient of political cash from pharmaceutical profiteers. He is also wrong. Every single swing seat House Democrat who endorsed Medicare for all won re-election, tweeted Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on November 7th. Every single one. Indeed, of the 8 soft Dems who lost their House seats, all refused to back health care for all. This is Jim Hightower saying polling shows that 72% of voters favor changing to a government-run health care plan. There's the party's future.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Recent analysis of the 2020 election from the America's Communities Project reveals how Trump lost ground in places long considered key GOP strongholds. Dante Chinni says Trump's failure to perform better in the middle suburbs was key to his defeat. And we say hello to Dante Chinni, who directs the American Communities Project at the George Washington University. Also is a data and politics reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Dante, thanks for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
And I should say thank you for joining us again, as we have spoken in the past.
Yep.
Shortly after the election, your group released a report on where Biden and Trump gained and lost voters. And one of your takeaways is that Trump did not do as well as he hoped in what you call the middle suburbs. So who lives in the middle suburbs, and why is Trump losing ground with these voters?
So the middle suburbs is something that were going to be crucial to Donald Trump's reelection bid. They're a collection of counties largely throughout the industrial Midwest. Who lives there? They're largely blue collar. They're not as diverse as the nation as a whole, so they tend to be fewer minorities, fewer African Americans, fewer Hispanics, more white people, more whites without a college degree. So kind of his sweet spot in terms of voters. And he was hoping, I think, basically what he did what he managed to do in 2016 was Mitt Romney won these counties by about 2 points. Trump won them by about 13 points. And if you looked at where they were based, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, they were the reason he won. And what happened this election, those numbers shrank, and they shrank by a good amount. And there are a number of reasons we could say a number of places we could say Donald Trump lost this election, but the middle suburbs there's a really good argument to be made that they were leading the problem for him.
Mm-hmm. Trump spent a lot of his campaign appealing to a fear-mongering voice to suburban women. What does your analysis suggest as far as that strategy? Fail, pass?
Yeah, so that was something we were wondering about even going in, because one of the things we spend a lot of time talking about the American Communities Project is that counties or suburbs are a very complicated thing. We think of the suburbs, and the suburbs are not the way they used to be. They're much more diverse than they used to be. They're bigger. They're in some parts they're better educated. They're more diverse. And our thought going in is this was a play for these middle suburbs. That's what he was trying to talk to. And we thought it was going to hurt him in some of these urban suburbs, better educated areas. It looks like it didn't help him in the middle suburbs. It was a fail. It was a pretty big fail because he needed to bump up those numbers even. And if the thread here in the comments he was making was, look, these people are coming to take away your suburban life. It didn't help him in the middle suburbs, and we'll talk later. It didn't help him in the other suburban environments either. It was definitely a net loss for Donald Trump, even though it was clear what he was trying to do with the strategy. I just think it was based on an outdated idea of what the suburbs even are today.
Another takeaway from your report is that Trump did well with Hispanic voters, and you looked closely at where those voters live, which is obviously key. What does that tell you about why Hispanic voters turned out for Trump?
So, look, we're in that period. We're far enough after the election now where we can start really doing some data analysis because there's this initial rush and like everybody's trying to figure out what happened. And we get a lot of stuff wrong right away. This Hispanic voter question is something we're going to have to look into a little more. There was clearly loss when we talked about what happened in Miami. Obviously, Trump did much better in Miami. It's one of the reasons he won Florida, and that's so people would say, well, he did better in Miami, but those are Hispanics, they're Cubans, they're Venezuelans, they're different kind of Hispanic than the Latinos who live along the Texas border. But Trump did really well along the Texas border. He really did. He didn't win all those counties, but he really narrowed the margins. Places Democrats won by 20 points, 30 points, 40 points, they're won by half that, or like a 40-point margin went down to a single-digit margin. We want to know what happened there. We're trying to understand what happened there. One of my theories is that these counties along the border, they're very rural, they're somewhat remote. They look actually a lot like rural white America, except they're heavily Hispanic. Like you're talking about places that are 80% Hispanic, 90% Hispanic, very large Hispanic populations in these counties. A very small white population. So there's a lot of homogeneity. And that, again, looks like rural America, conservative, homogeneous, lower education rates. And it may be that Trump was able to kind of cash in on this pull that the Republican Party and that he has, in particular with rural voters. Maybe he found a cross-rural, kind of talking point there where he could reach rural Hispanics as well as rural whites. But it's something we've got to dig into more and see what's in the data, because right now it's still a mystery somewhat.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to Dante Chinni, who directs the American Communities Project at the George Washington University. He's also data and politics reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Dante, turning to Democrats, Biden did well in big cities and urban suburbs. This was expected. But have you picked up on any changes that should give Democrats cause for alarm or maybe celebration?
I'd say two things. I mean, I think Biden, people ask so did Biden do really well with African Americans in big cities, which are a huge part of the Democratic coalition, particularly in the northern states. And you go to Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And my response is, when I look at the data, and again, we're still looking at the data, is he did well enough. He didn't do particularly great. He did better in some places than Hillary Clinton, a little better, not monstrously better. But where he really did do better was in these urban suburbs, which are better educated, higher income, white for the most part, or they're diverse, but they're still definitely more white than minority. And the thing that was most interesting to me, I don't know if I want to, it's up to you. You can call it cause for celebration, whatever you want. There was a remarkable thing that happened in these places we call the exurbs. And these places are very white. They lean Republican, heavily Republican. And Trump still won them. And he won them by a lot. He won them by 11 points. But 4 years ago, he won them by 17 points. That's a 6-point shift. And these are places that are a little further out than your inner ring suburbs, a little more rural, a little more spread out, but still well-educated, high incomes, and again, very white. And Biden did 6 points better there. There is a sign in these data, if you're looking for an overall message in the data, that urban areas and even suburban areas are becoming more Democratic. Now the middle suburbs are a little more complicated, but well-educated suburban areas are definitely look as though they're starting to break more Democratic. So if you're a Democrat, that's something to feel very good about, I think. The question is, in these big cities, the margins are not, again, it's, it's not Barack Obama on the ticket. Having the first African-American, candidate and then president helps with African-American turnout. But I do think that, I think that Democrats were hoping, and this is a question for Democrats, that they'd even do a little better in those big cities. They did well, but They did well enough, but not great. I really think the story of this for Democrats is the suburbs are increasingly Democratic turf, and well-educated suburbs in particular increasingly look like Democratic turf. Now, whether that outlives Trump, we'll see. But it's in these data, that's something that definitely seems to be popping.
Now, something else, you advise caution in this report about reading too much into any election.
Yeah.
At the same time, you do point out that what you're seeing fits into broader trends in polling that show the nation's two primary political parties evolving into different entities, one more urban and socio and economically diverse, and the other more rural and largely more white.
Yep.
Do you see in this trend a deepening polarization in American politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing we've seen this for a while in American politics over the last decade, but it's getting, in the aftermath of this election, the divides are really becoming stark because it's even people willing to accept the results or not. The divides that we've seen in politics over the past 10, 15, I guess 20 years now, definitely 15 years, has deepened in this election. And I would argue there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. And they're about, we have sociologically, we have separated ourselves into like-minded tribes. We choose to live near people that are like us. The people that are like us like the same things we do, which attracts certain consumer goods and certain brands. And like these things reinforce themselves. So you really do end up living in a very different America. You can live in a different America than a place that's 10 miles away or 20 miles away that can still be well-educated or not as well-educated, but feel very different. The tribalism in American politics is something that is deepening, and it's concerning because at some point, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or however you feel about politics, we do have to come together to solve problems. And that gets very hard when we're not even, there have always been slight differences in how people see reality, but the differences are getting so stark now. And when you talk about, people going off into their separate camps, these data suggest those lines are getting deeper. And again, the aftermath of this election suggests that there are real problems to that getting deeper. We're living in very different realities right now.
And we should point out, I mean, these divisions didn't start 4 years ago. These divisions have been growing for some time. However, have these divisions been accelerated over the last 4 years because of Donald Trump?
Yeah, my answer to that is probably yes. And the first thing when you started this question, you were talking about don't read too much in one election, which is what I've made clear with people over and over again. Donald Trump, we have yet to see how unique Donald Trump is. How much of this was about Donald Trump? And do the effects of Donald Trump, how long do they last after Donald Trump? We don't know that yet. And some of that may have to do with the way the Democrats end up, how Joe Biden decides to govern. If the Democrats somehow manage to win those 2 seats in Georgia and take out the Senate, what do they do with it? Those questions, I mean, there are all these different elements to the two parties. And what they do, whether they lean left or lean right or go further left or go further right, I think they're reactions to what the parties do and reactions to what politicians do. So yes, this began a long time ago. It's been going on for at least, 15 years when we talk about these shifts that we're seeing in the electorate. Trump sped them up. The question is, will they push back a little bit without Donald Trump, or did he push them forward and they permanently have gone forward and we're going to keep marching in this direction? I don't know the answer to that question. It's going to be fascinating to kind of watch unfold over the next, 3-4 years here.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we let you go, obviously your team is doing a great deal more analysis of this election. What are some of the key questions that you're looking into?
So we're going to do, once the data get a little more finalized, there's another huge shift that happened that was fascinating to us in these military communities. They went for Donald Trump, but again, Biden did 6 points better than Hillary Clinton did. That's really interesting. And that's something we need to explore and understand better. I think I want to get a better understanding of what happened in the college towns because Hillary basically Biden in a lot of those places got Hillary Clinton's numbers plus Jill Stein's numbers or plus some of the third party vote from 2016. What happened in those places? We need to see. I mean, are they going to be accepting if Joe Biden takes a more moderate approach in governing? Are they going to be accepting of that? Are they going to be, leaning back toward wanting more of a true leftward agenda? Those are the questions that I really want to stay. And then the last thing, obviously, is these middle suburbs. Trump didn't do as well on them, but they do lean Republican, I think, deep down because of the lower college education numbers and then very white. What happens to those places over the next 3 or 4 years is going to be very important to see.
It's fascinating. The work that you do is fascinating. And I'm looking forward to the next time we talk and just how much has changed, or even just your analysis of this election. Dante Chinni, who directs the American Communities Project at the George Washington University, also data and politics reporter for the Wall Street Journal, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Dante, as always, we appreciate your time with us and look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Well, see you soon, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with former DNC chair Tom Perez on a new era in American politics and the path to 2022 for Democrats.
When you look at 2020, Tom, for Democrats, it's hard to argue with the success, winning the White House, holding on to control of the House, and when all the votes were counted and the runoffs were finished, winning control of the United States Senate. What worked?
Well, this is an outcomes business, Bill, and you're correct. I'm very proud of the fact that we have the White House, didn't have that 4 years ago. We have the Senate, didn't have that 4 years ago, and we have the House, didn't have that 4 years ago. In addition, 4 years ago, Bill, we had 15 Democratic governors. Now we have 23. Mm-hmm. We have 24 Democratic attorneys general right now. We had, I think, 17 4 years ago. We flipped 8 state legislative chambers. We broke supermajorities. You know, you talk to Governor Cooper in North Carolina. When he won his race in 2016, he was dealing with Republican supermajorities. Right. In both the House and the Senate. And in 2018, we broke the supermajority. So now he has more ability to govern. And what worked was we really implemented an every zip code strategy. We got in there, we organized early, we organized everywhere. We worked very closely with our state party partners. We worked very closely with the broader Democratic ecosystem. I mean, you look at the last races, I should say, in right. Georgia, and that was all hands on deck. And obviously, Stacey Abrams and her organization, the work that they did didn't start November the 4th of 2020. I think the success that we had throughout this country was a function of the fact that we really were intentional. And the we is not just the DNC. I'm proud of what we did. I mean, 8,000 campaigns used our data and tech platform. Wow. Our voter file. Yeah. And we had to rebuild our infrastructure, Bill, and rebuild trust. And I think we've done both. And frankly, you were helpful in both because, Bill, you have credibility across, I think, the entire spectrum of the Democratic Party. When I came to the DNC, we were a wounded brand in the eyes of many. And the reforms we undertook, and I was on your show back in the day talking about superdelegate reform. And so it's really a combination of making those major investments in organizing, data and technology, communications, building partnerships so that we were truly part of a broad ecosystem where everybody had their oar in the water and they were rowing in synchrony. That's what was going on in Georgia post November 4th into the run-up. I mean, we invested $20 million at the DNC in Georgia, and we were proud to be part of a broader ecosystem. We weren't the leaders. There were other leaders on the ground. Mm-hmm. We were proud to support those folks.
You mentioned Stacey Abrams. I mean, her contribution in Georgia is just remarkable. Are there Stacey Abrams type movements across the country and other states as well?
I think it's been wonderful. Let me give another example of a state that excites me as much as any in the 2020 cycle, and that was Arizona.
Oh, yeah.
Arizona. So when I got to the DNC, we were doing a mapping exercise early on. Where is the potential? Just looking at the data. Where was the potential? And you didn't need to be a PhD in analytics to take a look and see that Georgia and Arizona were ripe. And we invested early in Arizona. In 2017, we started investing with the party and with others. And in 2018, we had the election of Kyrsten Sinema. We saw other down ballot races. We won the Secretary of State race there, which was a major victory. And the thing about Arizona, and I really invite your listeners to take a close look at Arizona. The seeds of our success in Arizona were actually sown 10 years earlier. 10 years ago, I was at the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, and we investigated Joe Arpaio. Joe Arpaio was an idiot sheriff. Joe Arpaio never deserved to wear a badge. But there were things going on in Arizona. Joe Arpaio was abusing his authority. There was a bill called SB 1070 that was a very, very virulent anti-immigration bill that passed Arizona, went all the way to the Supreme Court. I was part of the team that took that case all the way to the Supreme Court. We won that case. Why am I bringing this up, Bill? There were so many activists back in 2010 who said, you know what, we're going to turn this moment into a movement. And you know what happened? The likes of my good friend Ruben Gallego, he was part of the activists who then said, I'm going to run for office. And he's now a remarkably rising star in the Democratic Party in the U.S. House. He is doing great things. Raquel Terán might not be a name who's a recognizable figure. Just over the last few days, she was elected chair of the Arizona Democratic Party. Raquel was part of the movement against Joe Arpaio and SB 1070. She's a member of the state legislature, as well as now being the chair of the Arizona Democratic Party. I bring this up because as a result of these abuses, people stood up. They turned a moment into a movement. And you look at Arizona and you see that there was a fusion coalition that powered both Joe Biden and Mark Kelly to victory. And it started with Latinos, but it didn't end with Latinos. It was Native Americans, African Americans, Mormons, McCain Republicans, white, non-white voters who came together, and the investments that were made over the course of time. And I'm not just talking about the DNC, Bill. I'm talking about a host of entities who were registering voters in the great state of Arizona. I think we are built to last. Arizona is officially purple. And it's purple because of years of hard work.
Right. And Georgia's purple, too. Well, at the same time, with all the success, there are, to be honest, right, there were some disappointments, too. In the House, we thought we might pick up 15 seats. Instead, Democrats actually lost 13 seats. The Senate, we thought we had a good shot in Maine and South Carolina, North Carolina, Montana. Didn't get those states and only have a tie now in the Senate thanks to the runoffs in Georgia. So does that make you worried about 2022?
Well, I'm proud of what we did, but I agree with you. We didn't win all the races we wanted to win. We won the biggest one in the White House, and we still have the House and we have the Senate. That's huge. But here's, I think, the challenges that lie ahead. And we saw this in 2020. We've defeated Trump, but we haven't defeated Trumpism. And I think you have to separate the Senate and the House here to conduct this analysis. When you have a wave election, and now I'm talking about House waves, what tends to happen 2 years later, because if you have that midterm wave, then you go into a presidential. Those races that you won that brought you a wave, you won those in pretty red districts. So, for instance, we won a seat in Oklahoma in 2018. That was a Trump plus 12 or 14 district, and we had a great, great candidate. Same thing in New Mexico, the 1st Congressional District, Xochitl Torres Small. We had in her a great candidate, but that's a Trump plus double-digit district. And so you then fast forward to 2020. Donald Trump, his voters turned out. I mean,
yep.
And so when that happens, you're bound to have that sort of challenge. And Bill, by the way, when we won, we've seen the same thing with Democrats, with Republicans, where the 2010 wave in the House for Republicans, same thing happened in 2012. We were able to win some of those seats back. And then in the Senate, I think there's a different, and it's a troubling trend, which is that the party that wins the presidential races now, it increasingly that is percolating down to Senate races. Or to put it differently, there are, back in the day, Joe Donnelly could win Indiana. Claire McCaskill could win Missouri. Heidi Heitkamp could win in North Dakota. And then you saw in 2018, those were heavily red Trump states, and they were unable to win. Now, there's a couple unicorns that we're seeing at the moment. We saw a unicorn in your good friend, Sherrod Brown. He was able to win in Ohio in 2018. And it turns out that Susan Collins on the Republican side appears to be a unicorn of sorts because Joe Biden won Maine and she was able to win her reelection. But the reality is in the Senate, Steve Bullock's a good example. Great candidate. He's demonstrated the capacity to win in a red state, but it didn't work in 2020 in no small measure because we're in this moment in time of tribalism of sorts. And the last point I'll make on this, Bill, which is really important, is if you look at the mega trends across this country, by like 2035, 70% of the population in the United States is going to live in 15 states. Or to put it differently, 70% of the U.S. Senate is going to be elected by 30% of the population. And those states tend to skew white and more rural. That gets me back to my original point in this conversation. I said we became an every zip code party. We have to continue organizing in Georgia. We have to continue and go back to Alabama and Mississippi. We can win Alabama and Mississippi if we have sustained engagement of Black voters in those states. Doug Jones showed that, and I am confident we can do that. We cannot give up on these states. We must continue to organize there, or else our high water mark in the Senate is going to be 51 to 52, given those mega trends that I've described. That's why I'm really proud of the fact that we really are a 57 state and territory party. And I hope in the near future we're going to have Puerto Rico and we're going to have the District of Columbia. But until then, we've got to understand these mega trends, and we've got to understand the power. We can win in these places that people said we couldn't.
So looking at 2022 and or looking at the next opportunity we have, there were 139 members of the House and 8 members of the Senate who voted on January 6th, the evening after the Capitol had been ravaged and stormed by this Trump mob. 139 House members and 8 senators still voted to overturn the electoral vote in 2 states. Is there any focus campaign to target those members? Let's say they're not expelled from Congress, which I think they ought to be, but they probably won't be. Is there any focus campaign we know who they are, we know their districts, to go after every one of them?
Well, I'll tell you, here's the challenge with that, and there should be. I mean, that was an insurrection. When you turn the Capitol into a crime scene, and I don't know if you've read recently, one of the many ramifications of this is that there are a lot of Capitol Police officers now who've contracted COVID. That was one of the things. It was a super spreader event. Members of Congress contracting COVID because they were in rooms with their Republican colleagues who were unmasked. And so, major challenges there. But your question really highlights a bigger point, which is a real challenge in our democracy. I think the two of the biggest forces that have brought democracy to its knees are Citizens United and gerrymandering, whether it's partisan gerrymandering or racial gerrymandering. And the challenge, Bill, in a lot of those districts that you're referring to is that they've been so gerrymandered that it's next to impossible. What they did was what their constituents wanted because they've drank the Kool-Aid. They've bought into this absolutely bogus narrative about elections and how it was stolen. Republicans should be celebrating record turnout. I mean, to get back to your earlier question, part of the reason we lost down ballot races is because Trump did turn out his people in a lot of these areas, but that's not what they're celebrating. And so I think the challenge, Bill, and it really, what your question really gets at is until and unless we fix this issue of gerrymandering, and regrettably, this U.S. Supreme Court, gave a green light to it. And you watch what's going to happen. These state legislatures that have complete control, where you've got a Republican governor, Republican Senate, Republican House, you are going to see additional efforts to make it harder for people to vote. The response to Joe Biden winning Georgia isn't going to be for them to say, hey, well, maybe we should give people health care, or maybe we should raise wages, or maybe we should fix the pandemic. No, their response is going to be, let's make it harder for our perceived opponents to vote. That's the challenge we have, Bill. And that's why Josh Hawley, I'm glad that there's advocacy against him. He's smart. He does have brain matter, and that's what makes him so insidious.
Bill Press with Tom Perez, former chairman of the Democratic National Committee. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Ross Benish, Dante Chinni, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.